Okay, we're going to talk about arsenic and its relationship to rice and the chemistry of arsenic problems. So starting out, let's look at the periodic table. One can see in the same vertical column as nitrogen, we've got phosphate and arsenic. So arsenic is immediately below phosphate, and that's real important because arsenic can mimic phosphate in the body, okay, phosphorus in the body. Okay, arsenic is pretty ubiquitous in the Earth environment. It comes from the Earth's crust. It's widespread in the Earth's waters. So you can't completely escape from it. It's more concentrated in some areas of Asia, like the worst is like in Bangladesh. And mining itself, a very common human activity in the last 200 years, it pulls these heavy metals and other toxic chemicals out of the mountains. You know, it's almost as if they were stored there in the mountains for a good reason, perhaps. And now they get spread into the water and everywhere else, all kinds of stuff that you don't really want around from digging into the mountains. All right. Rice, the brown rice has a lot of the arsenic in the bran. White rice has less arsenic as the bran is removed. So in general, one way to reduce your arsenic level is eat white rice. There's a lot more arsenic in rice coming from the southeastern United States, about twice as much, because those areas used to grow cotton, for example, and the crops, the cotton was a textile product. It was sprayed with a lot of arsenic type pesticides because of the boll weevils to prevent that. There's less arsenic, it's thought, in California, so people sometimes will recommend buy California rice. One thing you got to watch out for, just because it's called California, I want to see that it was grown in California, because I worry is somebody just going to call their rice California rice even though it's not from California. So make sure it's truly from California. Chicken feces were used as fertilizer for rice. So the problem with that is chicken had intestinal parasites. And when the chicken had intestinal parasites, they fed them arsenic medications. And then the chicken feces were sold to the rice farmers and used as fertilizer. And that got more arsenic into the soil where rice was grown. By the way, Dr. McDougall has a nice newsletter where he talks about rice and arsenic. And he says he'll still eat rice. He's never seen a case in his career of arsenic toxicity. I myself, I used to eat rice every single day. Now I only eat it about 2 or 3 times a week. So what have I done differently? We'll talk about this at the end, but I switched to eating some other starches, and I do some stuff also to lower the arsenic in the rice. Things to watch out for, other big sources of arsenic. Seafood, forget about seafood. It's not good for you. Forget about seaweed too. I wouldn't eat that either. Potentially quite high in arsenic. There's always going to be some arsenic in almost every single food. It's even in significant amounts in some baby cereals. So you're probably better off with like an oatmeal-based baby cereal than a rice-based baby cereal to reduce the arsenic. And I was just noting, you know, poor kids nowadays, they get so much junk from all the junk food they eat that's, well, don't want to talk about that now. Okay, water, especially in some places like Bangladesh, that's an arsenic disaster, in West Bengal, parts of India. They've got really high arsenic in their water, and there's a lot of online videos about that and how they're trying to improve their water. The goal ideally is to have less than 10 parts per billion in the drinking water. And then everybody talks about rice, but you know, there's a lot more arsenic in chicken than there is in rice, and there was quite a bit of arsenic in apple juice, grape juice, and some other foods. It's in all foods to some extent. They used to spray the orchards with arsenic pesticides. Before DDT came along, arsenic was sort of the dominant pesticide. Then DDT came along. And then gradually, since all that time, arsenic's being phased out. And they're using a lot more of the other types of herbicides with the non-organic stuff especially. But the point is that arsenic will persist in the soil for decades. So there's still some in there. But all this talk about rice, chicken's got way more arsenic than rice. They found that the chicken would, you know, treat their intestinal parasites so they grow faster, gain more weight, and actually the chicken looks a little fresher in the store for a longer amount of time by using arsenic. So it's pretty much tightly connected. I don't ever eat chicken. It's like the worst food. And I can also tell you, every fat person I know thinks chicken's a health food. It's not. You don't want to eat that stuff. Turkey is really in the same ballpark of being unhealthy. Nowadays, too, non-organic food, they use human sewage sludge in some places. They call them biosolids, and those are associated with relatively high levels of arsenic. Some countries, I wouldn't buy food from those places just because I don't trust them to follow their own rules, even in You worry about them being contaminated with all kinds of things. Coal burning electric plants are, put arsenic into the air as well as lead and mercury. You don't want to live near those places. I'll just tell you one story. About 15 years ago or so, my family knew somebody who just bought a big property out near one of these coal burning electric plants. And, me being the way I am, I said, that's stupid. They're going to regret it. They're going to become sick from inhaling all the chemicals from the coal burning electric plants. And we were going to visit them. So my family told me to shut up. I'm autistic. I have no social skills. Don't say a word to these people. And anyways, exactly what I predicted happened. The kid had problems in school. Real nice kid. It led to other problems. He ended up committing suicide. It was a very sad thing. Okay? But what I said, because also they told me, I'm just jealous of these people because they're richer than me. They can afford a fancy place. I said, you don't move next to a coal burning electric plant. You're going to inhale that stuff every day, and it puts you at high risk to get sick. That's not a good strategy. Probably the reason why the land's cheap is because it's not good land to buy. You don't want to live near any type of stinky air pollution on a routine basis. Wood preservatives are very common to have arsenic forms in them. And that's why you tell your kid to wash their hands if they've been playing on the deck in your backyard or if they're eating at a picnic table at the park or something, because it's probably arsenic-treated wood. You don't want to get that on your hands, get that into your food. Okay, a couple things about arsenic. It has no purpose in the human body, zero benefit. We talked about it being in the same row of the periodic table as phosphorus. That's why it can mimic phosphorus in the human body and then enter enzymes. You got to remember, ATP has 3 phosphates on it. It also damages DNA in some way that's not fully understood from the articles I read. It produces the byproducts of DNA damage. Glutathione, the antioxidant, helps to prevent arsenic-induced toxicity. So it's good to eat plenty of fruits and vegetables, keep your antioxidant levels high. There's organic forms and inorganic forms. The main forms for our purposes is pentavalent arsenate, P for pentavalent, P for phosphate. It mimics that, and it's going to block an enzyme in glycolysis. T for trivalent arsenite. That's going to block an enzyme at the beginning of Krebs cycle, sort of the connection between glycolysis and Krebs cycle, which is the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase. Okay, we're just going to do a little bit of chemistry here, just because it'll make more sense of everything. First of all, this is just the beginning of glycolysis. Glucose comes into the cell. It's phosphorylated to put a big negative charge on it, so now it can't exit out the cell with a big charge on it. A little trick for memorizing glycolysis. You don't need to know this, and we're going to go through this real fast, but if anybody actually cares about understanding glycolysis, glucose is an aldehyde, so think of it as glucose. Fructose is a ketone. There's a ketone, just a carbon, double bonded to oxygen in the middle of other carbons. Aldehyde has double bond to oxygen next to hydrogen. If you remember those two things, trust me, I've had to memorize this thing backwards and forwards. That little trick really helps you to not get confused later on. Glyceraldehyde is also an aldehyde. And this enzyme, glyceraldehyde 3-dehydrogenase, is one that's going to be inhibited by arsenic. So that's going to become relevant. Reversible inhibition of glycolysis by arsenate. Okay, so here's that same compound we were talking about, glyceraldehyde. So it's an aldehyde, double bond to the oxygen, and then just a hydrogen coming from that same carbon. Okay, then here's the enzyme, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. And the key thing to know is anytime you see a dehydrogenase enzyme, you know you're going to go from NAD plus to NADH. And that's like we talked about in a recent previous lecture about alcohol, was that alcohol dehydrogenase produces NADH and the cytoplasm, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. So that large amount of NADH produced from alcohol metabolism blocks this reaction. So the other thing is we've talked in previous lectures about insulin resistance. So by the way, the reason I'm kind of going through this is because the way you get good at biochemistry and become conversant in it is whenever the topic comes up, you think about it and you use the material. This is not just something for a test. This is something in real life that's worth knowing. And once you just focus on the key point, it's easy. It's difficult in school to memorize every little detail, and no one's asking you to do that. But to just know a few things that are useful, that's worth knowing. Alcohol blocks glycolysis. That's worth knowing. Insulin resistance due to skeletal muscle accumulation of fat blocks glycolysis. That's worth knowing. Arsenic blocks glycolysis. That's worth knowing. Glycolysis is the fundamental pathway for energy metabolism in the human body run anaerobically, and you have to run your glycolysis essentially for glucose metabolism before you can get a bunch of ATPs out down the road from the other steps. Okay, so how does arsenic do this? Well, here, this tells what's going on. If you look at this picture here, here's a phosphate. So there's a phosphorus molecule in the center. It's got a double bond to the first oxygen. Then it's got bonds to 3 more oxygens. And these are single bonds with a negative charge on them. In reality, it can resonate amongst them, but for our purposes, there's a negative charge on each oxygen. Okay? And now here's arsenate. Arsenate is basically almost the same thing. You got the arsenic molecule in the center, double bond to oxygen up here, and then 3 oxygens with negative charges on them. So because they're so similar, they're in the same vertical row of the periodic table, that arsenate can go into the phosphate binding site on this enzyme, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, and the arsenate becomes incorporated into the product of the molecule. Okay, so the initial molecule over here is called the substrate, then there's the enzyme for the reaction, and then here's the products. So with that arsenate on there, that cannot be made into an ATP. So there's diminished ATP production because of the arsenic. So that's going to make the cell less able to do all the things it needs to do. It's going to give the person less energy. Okay, so marching along in glycolysis, 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde, we talked about that. There's our enzyme that's blocked to some extent, depending on how much arsenic was ingested, 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde dehydrogenase. Then it goes to 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, 3-phosphoglycerate, 2-phosphoglycerate, phospholinopyruvate, pyruvate. Okay, so that's just basically the final steps of glycolysis. And so what we care about is pyruvate. Pyruvate right here, you can see there's a carboxylic acid deprotonated. Adjacent to it is a ketone. This is actually what you would call, with the acid here, and then call this carbon number 1, call this the alpha carbon. This would be an alpha keto acid. Okay, but anyways, pyruvate is now a very important molecule. We're going to look at it on the next slide, what it does. So pyruvate is one of those super important molecules sort of at the crossroads of metabolism. If there's no oxygen available, pyruvate can be just made into lactate. That's what happens under anaerobic conditions. Like let's say you've been exercising real intensely, just run a 100-meter sprint. You'll have a lot of lactate generated. That can be sent to the liver and recycled into glucose and other things. Okay. Pyruvate sometimes can be made reversed in the appropriate setting and made into glucose again. Okay. It can be made into an amino acid, alanine. Actually, I don't have the line in here. It can be made to replenish Krebs cycle intermediates and be made into oxaloacetate. So pyruvate can do a lot of things. But for our purposes, what matters about pyruvate? Pyruvate goes through an enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase. See that name again? Dehydrogenase. So that means it's going to have to generate an NADH. So this would be another enzyme potentially affected by our alcohol generating all that NADH. Okay, but what's going to happen here? Arsenite is another variation on arsenic, and this where it's bound to 3 oxygens. And the problem is it gets into the enzyme and it blocks it. It binds to the sulfhydryl groups, and it's an irreversible bond. So this is actually worse problem than the inhibition of the glycolysis enzyme we just spoke about a moment ago. So the arsenite will inhibit pyruvate dehydrogenase. This prevents pyruvate, a 3-carbon molecule, from being converted into acetate, a 2-carbon molecule, so it's a decarboxylation reaction. But now that reaction product of this cannot get into Krebs cycle, so it's blocking Krebs cycle. That's your major metabolic pathway to run glucose to Krebs cycle to electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria. So basically, this is a devastating decrease in the amount of energy that can produce from the glucose that the person ate. By the way, when I eat rice, I always eat a few extra fruits just to have a little more energy on board in case there's any of this. And we're going to talk about that. I think that the rice problem with arsenic is exaggerated, that it's a much worse problem with chicken and other settings as well. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But it is a problem. Okay, so what about some of these arsenic diseases? We talked about fatigue just from diminishing the amount of ATP you're making from the glucose that you ingest. It also has some effect on oxidative phosphorylation, making of ATP in the mitochondria. it has a detrimental effect on endothelial nitric oxide, so it causes vasoconstriction instead of what you normally would want is vasodilation. It's another reason too. I eat a couple extra fruits. I figure I'll get more potassium, more vasodilation. Acute toxicity, a person can have abdominal pain, diarrhea leading to dehydration, dark urine, electrolyte abnormalities. That's more of an acute high-dose toxicity setting. But a more common problem is chronic arsenic ingestion, especially in somewhere like Bangladesh where there's very high amounts in the water, more than 10 parts per billion. And that chronic repeated exposure, you'll often get it on the hands. There's a lot of keratin here. It tends to go to keratin areas because there's a lot of thiol groups in there, sulfhydryl groups. And it'll bind there, and they'll get these thickened scars like the surface of the moon on their hands, and also on the soles of their feet. It's called hyperkeratosis. It's one of the characteristic fast ways to recognize when somebody's had arsenic toxicity. And again, by the way, Dr. McDougall said he'd never seen a single case, and he is in California where people eat tons of rice. I've never seen a case either. I've never seen a case in a conference. I've never heard anybody talk about it. So what I'm saying is, certainly in the United States, it's uncommon that clinically it manifests, okay? I mean, you don't want to be ingesting this stuff for no reason, but I'm saying it's not that common. It really isn't. It does increase the risk of cancer according to the studies. However, there's been other studies showing people who eat rice, they don't have an increased risk of cancer. There's a paper, I have the reference for it at the end. What do? Arsenic can be measured in the human blood, in the urine, which is better for acute exposure, is urinary, because it's excreted primarily through the urine. Some goes out through the bile. It also accumulates in the hair, sort of a keratinized, heavily keratinized part of our bodies. There are some chelators. Those are medicines that bind to it. Chelators will bind to the arsenic and help reduce its amounts in the body. You know, but when you're talking about a chronic thing, you're not going to be taking a chelator every day. You want to just avoid it. The detoxification process of arsenic in our body involves methylating, putting methyl groups on there, you know, a carbon with 3 hydrogens on it. And the acetyldenyl methionine is the methyl donor. So the bottom line is eating your plants gives you a lot of folate, gives you a lot of antioxidants that help to detoxify arsenic. Again, that's why I told you I eat rice a couple times a week, and I'll always have a couple extra fruits when I eat the rice. I always have a salad too. I do that anyways. Test your water. You want to make sure that you have low amounts of arsenic in your drinking water, less than 10 parts per billion. And if you use reverse osmosis for drinking water, which I recommend, make sure you eat some food first to decrease the osmolality. To increase the osmolality, because otherwise I worry that reverse osmosis is almost over-purified. That's what what I've spoke about in my other lectures on water filtration and water purity is the water paradox. The more you filter water to get all the stuff out that you don't want, the more hypoosmolar it is, putting you at risk for hyponatremia and problems like that. So that's why I always eat first. I actually really don't drink much water. I get most of my water from just eating plant foods. There's a lot of water in fruits. There's a lot of water once you start gobbling down rice and beans and potatoes and all that stuff. So I find myself hardly ever drinking water, just a little bit here and there. I think this whole 8 cups a day thing is ridiculous. Does an 80-pound woman need the same amount of water as a 300-pound guy? And what good is it to drink a whole bunch of water if you're drinking tap water that's full of toxic chemicals? And then you can't drink lots of our reverse osmosis water because it's over-purified. It's hypoosmolar. So how can you drink a lot of water? You see the paradox? If you drink the unpurified stuff, it's toxic. If you drink the hyperpurified stuff, it's too hypoosmolar, meaning low in particle number, so it's not really that safe to drink. So you really can't drink that much water in a healthy way. Typical person I see drinking a lot of water is like a fat lady walking around with a big liter container, and they never lose weight, the people I've seen do that. Okay, anyways, back to this topic here. Best thing to do is try to avoid arsenic, never eat meat, especially we talked about how terrible chicken is and seafood. Meat's full of arsenic. A lot of meats are. I wouldn't go with the seaweed stuff. Seaweed still comes from the ocean, very polluted. And by the way, this is just one more thing to add to the problems of fish, besides all the other problems of fish. High fat, high mercury, high PCBs. They're also high in arsenic quite often. Nowadays I'll eat more other starches that I used to eat rice. I'll try to eat more potatoes, more sweet potatoes, for example, instead of the rice, which I used to eat a lot every day. I still eat it, like I said, 2-3 times a week. No processed food, 0. All kinds of junks in processed food. I knew a football player when I was in high school, kind of a rough guy. And he said to me, he said, when a parent signs a consent form to let their kid play football, they've just given me permission to maim their son. And I was like, whoa, I don't think I'm going to want my kid to play football after hearing that. And why do I say that? When you eat processed food, you've done the same thing. You've allowed them, they can basically put anything they want practically in processed food. You should never eat processed food. It's full of stuff you really don't want. It's really bad for you. Tons of sodium, tons of MSG, MFG, herbicides, pesticides, heavy metals, all kinds of stuff you don't want. Okay, I would never eat anything from China. I've heard too many bad things about the purity and safety of their foods. I only eat rice from safer areas like California, but like I said, I want to know that rice was grown in California under organic conditions and not just somebody's calling it California rice, but it's not really grown in California. So that's a trick to watch out for. Rinse it first. And when you rinse it first, that helps a little bit. Then also what's become recommended thing is to cook it on a stainless steel cookware, and then at the end pour the water off, the excess water off, and that's supposed to decrease the arsenic content by 50%. If you cook it in a pressure cooker, then the water stays in the food for the most part, and it kind of puffs it up. So you don't necessarily get rid of that arsenic. And some people say, oh, rinsing it doesn't do much good. You know, I don't know for certain. I haven't tested it, but I do know this. When you rinse water, a lot of stuff goes into that rinsate. So, you know, I think it's probably removing something significant. I'm going to guess that, even though I don't know that for sure. Okay, the human body detoxifies arsenic by reducing it. Glutathione is used for that. Yeah, so eating your healthy food, you get more glutathione. Just some references. This first article is good and the whole thing's free online. Mechanisms of arsenic toxicity. A lot of these articles you may or may not be able to get access to them. A lot of them you can't get access to, unfortunately, other than the abstracts on some of them. Depends. Arsenic levels. Consumer Reports has articles about arsenic in food. And I thought they were very much anti-rice, which I thought was unfair. You know, they don't talk at all about chicken. Whenever you see somebody talk about arsenic and all they talk about is rice and don't mention chicken, you have to wonder, is, you know, big agriculture and the junk food places funding that? Because why not talk about chicken? It's a much worse problem. Dr. Oz found 10 out of 12 apple juice with arsenic in them as a problem, over 10 parts per billion. So be careful with that. You know, I consider that stuff junk food for kids. I don't think it's a good idea to be giving that to kids. Let them eat the apple. Get an organic apple. Talked about McDougall's newsletter was pretty good on this subject. There's a bunch of other articles. This food forensic book's kind of a weird book, but it's also kind of good. Here it is. I'll show you this thing. I found this pretty good. I don't know if you got my little size scope there. Oh, I don't know if it was showing up. Anyways, I hope that was helpful.